Welcome to GouldFish on Games, where today I want to talk about these three games, the Westwood Dune trilogy. Rather than going into them in much depth, this will just be a quick look, and will be far more of a personal take on each of the games rather than being objective. But if you want a full review on any of them, just let me know in the comments. So let's take this in chronological order, shall we, and start with Dune II. This is the original PC release for MS-DOS, which came out in 1992. And this went by two names, Dune II, The Building of a Dynasty, and Dune II, Battle for Arrakis. But during development it was simply known as Dune, as the developers thought they were the only Dune game in development. But the game that we now know as Dune had magically uncancelled itself and had been rushed to the finishing line, and as such was published first. Which does lead to some confusion between the games, as they came out quite close to each other, but they don't really have that much in common. Westwood already had quite the reputation for having great intros for their game, and Dune II was no exception, which introduced the basics of the story as well as the three main sides, the two that were known from the books, and a brand new one, the Ordos.
Three houses fight for control of Dune. The noble Atreides, the insidious Ordos, and the evil Harkonnen.
And the first thing we'll do is select a house we want to play as, and here is something that always bugged me: the colours for the various houses are wrong. From the books, the Atreides colours were black, green and red, and the Harkonnen were blue and orange, and obviously the Ordos didn't exist. So I'm not sure why they mixed the colours up for this game. It was actually more correct in the Dune adventure game.
House Harkonnen.
When you select a house, you'll get some background on them, and if you proceed, you'll be introduced to the House Mentat, who will give you missions but also act as the copy protection and help system. In game, all the houses are more or less visually the same, with just the colour telling you who is who, but there is a few unique buildings that will help. They also mostly play the same, as each house has pretty much the same arsenal. They do get a few unique units and variations, including their own super weapon from the palace, but the bulk of the army is identical. Being one of the earliest examples of an RTS, this is missing many of the features and helpers that we've come to expect from the genre. There's no group select, and even moving and attacking is a little bit more clunky, as you have to select a unit, then press move, or you can hit the M key, then select where you want them to go, and you do the same for attack. This is also continued in the system for making buildings and units, where you have to click on a building, enter it, and then you can finally select what you need to be built, though it does give you the ability to have multiple heavy factories each producing their own unit at the same time. Overall, it was a very promising start to the RTS genre, and plays quite differently to what follows. But before we move on, we need to talk about the two ports. The first was the Amiga, which was mostly the PC version with a few trims here and there and a reduced unit count. And this is where I first played it back in the 90s.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The other was a Mega Drive port, which is actually quite interesting in its own right, with all the graphics being updated to be more top-down and larger so they were easy to see on a TV. The UI also got updated, gone is the sidebar, which allows for more viewable area, and the controls for the units are more direct. And in some ways it feels more of a prototype for what would come with Command & Conquer. It's very impressive for a console port, even if the game still controls better with the mouse.
Moving out.
Next up is what you could call the reboot of the Westwood Dune series, Dune 2000. And this was the very first game that I pre-ordered, and it was the very first game that massively disappointed me when I got it. It still came in this lovely big box and contained the manual and a CD. That extra storage was required, as it followed the Westwood games since Dune II and had FMV cutscenes. And these actually look amazing, and might be one of the better looking takes on Dune that I've ever seen. The basics of the intro are still the same. 3 houses, no set territories even though there are, and no rules apart from not allowed to use nukes. And there's also quite the cast.
Lady Alara, bound concubine and truthsayer to the Padishah Emperor.
The Duke! We will mine spice in the Imperial Basin, and for the Duke, we will rid this land of Harkonnen. Keep that in mind.
So from first impressions, this looks really quite good, which continues when you're in game. The environments look dusty and great, the units look interesting, and it feels like it might be the last great hurrah to the engine that powered C&C and Red Alert. The music is also amazing, mixing the original soundtrack with touches of the Dune movie with the brilliance of C&C. But it all falls apart, at least for me, in the gameplay. While it gained some much needed improvements in its UI, such as unit grouping, the move to a more classic C&C style interface really does make this feel like a skinned Command & Conquer game, which we see more when we look at the units. The double-barreled siege tank is now an allied artillery unit from Red Alert. The missile launcher is no longer this unpredictable but massively long-range weapon, and it's just a basic long-range missile unit. Gon is having to use each unit very carefully and trying to place them just right to make best use of them. The spaceport has at least survived, and is mostly the same, allowing you to order units at a discount if you're lucky, but what they'll have in stock will vary throughout the course of the game. The capturing of buildings was also changed to be more in line with C&C, as you now have to use an engineer to capture them. Unlike previously, where you could just send any trooper into a building that was in the red zone. All the super weapons make a return, and some are actually better than they used to be, like the Fremen, who were pretty much useless in the previous game, though some units feel as if they were nerfed, like the Devastator tank, which originally when destroyed it would do massive damage to units or buildings around it, and you could even set it off manually. And while both of these are still in the game, they are so in a far more reduced fashion.
Missile launch detected. Silos needed.
Standing by. Order received. Yes, sir. Order received.
Building.
And this leads us on to the final game in the Westwood Dune trilogy, Emperor Battle for Dune, which was a direct sequel to Dune 2000. And a few of the cast members even make a return for the FMV sequences, but there's also a few new ones that show up as well. And it seems it made no difference which side won the previous game, as they were all at it again, so you better get used to using the Atreides, Harkonnen and Ordos.
Oh my, that is too rich. I see the Atreides still harbor delusions of superiority.
I was told I would be able to speak. Baron, you will have your time.
Indeed, I will.
House Atreides will abide by the terms of the Great Convention.
And once we're in game, we're treated to the fancy new 3D engine that Westwood had been cooking up, and would later rename Sage. But this was its first outing, and it doesn't look too bad. And after the previous games, they must have decided to give every house a very unique look and feel, which is great, but some of the choices they made feel a little odd, as we'll see in some of the unit designs. As all the previous games just had that single biome, the desert, they decided it was time to expand on it, and it has you fighting inside giant highliners as well as on the planets of the various houses.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Lost. Unit lost. Construction started. New construction options are now available. Unit lost.
Unfortunately, these don't take away what feels like a bit of a clunky game. The AI has a habit of just using the long-range weapons to pummel your forces who will just sit there and take it. They won't move, or attack, or report on it, or defend themselves. So it's quite possible to lose units and buildings to a single siege weapon and have absolutely no idea until you spot it. And with these mobile units having much larger ranges than the defensive ones, you'll end up having to micromanage far more than in any of the previous games. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the units are a bit odd. Just look at the Harkonnen ones. We have one that's basically a huge saw wheel, and we've got this long-range meat thrower. So while I appreciate it not being just CNC, but with spice, some of the choices they have made do feel a little misplaced, and doesn't quite work in the framework of the series or the books. But at least they did ramp up the story, which was made far more involved than the previous games, with each of the houses having their own subplots going on, and you even get to work with some of the other houses, like Ix and the Tlaxu. It's a game that I really do wish that I had finished, but each time I do, its flaws hold me back. But maybe this time will be the charm.
Construction started. Unit lost. Unit lost. Train. Unit lost. Unit lost. Unit lost.
As we've seen, while the game has spanned almost a decade, there have been a number of consistent elements, from harvesting of the spice, which proved to be such a great idea they turned it into Tiberium for CNC, to the sandworms that can strike at any moment. With the most prevalent one being, I never really enjoyed playing as the Ordos. And while I think the series didn't get better with each new release, they are an important part of Westwood and the RTS genre. And until next time, I was the GouldFish, that was the spice that must flow, and this was GouldFish on Games.
Building.
Thank you for watching this slightly different style of video from me. I do hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider liking or subscribing. Or you can use your Mentat abilities to leave a comment, or check out the 2 other videos you can see on the screen right now.
Ready.